Okay, let's continue our discussion about basic composition. What happens in the brain when two words compose together. We've now seen some evidence that with MEG, we can find neural reflections of this process in the left anterior temporal lobe and in the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, both in comprehension and in production. And now the question then is, what specific computations do these identified effects actually reflect? And in particular, what we want to try to figure out is what hypotheses can we rule out, okay? So whenever we discover some neural correlate of a process, there's usually lots and lots of different explanations or interpretations of that effect that you're seeing. And so as a scientist, your task then is to try to narrow down the hypothesis space. So how many of those hypotheses can you eliminate? So in a sense, we're not working to try to prove that any one hypothesis is correct. That's actually kind of impossible to do because there might always be some hypothesis that you didn't think about, and that could be the right one. But what we can do is to show that our data are incompatible with certain accounts and compatible then with others. And so now here, as we're working to narrow down the hypothesis space, the absolutely most fruitful set of studies in our lab has been a set of studies that has aimed to relate the left anterior temporal lobe effects to literature that I already discussed when we were talking about lexical access. So remember when we were talking about lexical access, I told you that there is a theory about the left anterior temporal lobe as a semantic hub that operates for single words. We were not talking about combinations of words at that point. And so the idea is that there is this distributed representation of a concept that will have various features represented in various parts of the brain. But the left anterior temporal lobe is a site that binds together the features into a coherent concept. And the evidence for that comes from some neuroimaging literature, but then crucially from neurodegenerative diseases like semantic dementia, where you have atrophy in this region, and those patients seem to start losing their ability to bind together these features in a sense. And so a consequence of that is that they're not producing more specific labels for more specific concepts. So instead of apple, you might just say fruit or even just a thing. And so after we had discovered that basic linguistic composition also engages this area, we were really interested in trying to understand the relationship between these kinds of data and what we were learning. And in particular, we were interested in that relationship because it seemed like there was a rather plausible hypothesis about the relationship. And so these authors are saying that, well, what this region does is binds together features kind of within the meaning of a single word. And what we were seeing was that if you add a feature to a word, then that drives signal in this area. So it sort of raises the question of whether the left ATL effects that we were seeing were just an instance of this kind of a specificity effect. So obviously, we know red, if you add red to boat, you get a more specific description of a boat, which is now a red boat. And so we wanted to explore whether our effects could be explained as an instance of this more general phenomena that was already in the literature. Okay, so our question was whether the left ATL, the combinatory effects in the left ATL simply reflect the conceptual specificity. Our question was whether the left ATL in general simply reflects the conceptual specificity of the current representation. So poodle, if your current representation is poodle, that's more specific than dog. If your current representation is red boat, that's more specific than just boat. So basically the same phenomenon. If that was the case, then we should find a pattern that looks roughly like the following pattern if we were to manipulate conceptual specificity within the paradigm that we were already using. So let's imagine first we have like, consonant and string boat. I'm now plotting imagined amplitudes to boat, okay? So let's just say like that's this much signal. So this is just kind of cartoon data to sketch out a hypothesis. And so now we make that a little bit more specific. We add that typical adjectival modifier that should now increase the conceptual specificity of the representation by this one feature. And so then by hypothesis that boosts up the left ATL amplitude as well. And then let's imagine that the noun itself is already more specific, okay? So maybe now that already for a single word gets us to the same level that we have for the red boat, okay? It's just the basic logic. And then if we, further specify, oh, it's a red canoe, then that would be even higher. So this would be kind of like a straightforwardly linear relationship between conceptual specificity and left anterior temporal cortex activity. And if we saw a pattern like this, there would be no particular reason to think that the left ATL does anything particularly relevant for composition. It's just representing the specificity of the representation. Okay. So we tested this in a study that Masha Westerlund conducted as part of her dissertation research. And so here's the actual pattern. It was very surprising, okay? It did not work out the way we thought. I'll show you the histogram in a sec. But it turned out that it was not the case that the condition that elicited the highest activity was the situation where we had the more specific noun combining with the adjectival modifier, giving you a more specific representation. That was not the highest condition. Rather, the highest amplitude was elicited by the situation in which the more basic level, the less specific noun was combining with a modifier. Like that was the condition that got the left ATL the most excited. So let me now, so this is the our significant effect in activity in the left ATL, and the means across that significant effect pattern like this. So this part looks very much like the prediction. So this is the replication of the usual red boat effect. But then when we get the more specific head noun, the noun to which we're measuring the responses to, then there really wasn't a composition effect. Like adding a modifier did not add activity to the single word representation. Okay, so that was very surprising to us because we had seen at that point many replications of the kind of composition effect. We thought that every time you kind of give add the modifier, we would get this boost in activity. Okay, so what are the consequences of this type of result? Well, as a hypothesis killer, it's actually very powerful because what I'm showing you here is two conditions and their syntactic and logical semantic structures are completely identical. Like there's not a syntactic theory on this planet that would give you a different structure for a red boat versus red canoe. So that tells us that this activity really does not have a syntactic nature, and it also doesn't have a logical semantic nature since these also do not differ in that way. So the semantic types are very much the same. Rather, it seems that the activity reflects something much more conceptual. And exactly what the right description of that process is very much still ongoing research, but it does eliminate those more kind of grammatical processes from the explanation. So it could be something more what psychologists call conceptual combination. So this is a difference between fields. So you won't find this term in the linguistics literature, but it is a term that is used in the psychology literature when we're talking about basically semantic composition. And here, like the actual conceptual content of the composing elements matters and is thought to be, you know, that real input to the composition. So how should we then think about this pattern? How can we make some sense of it? I'm going to give you one way to think about it. The intuition from the very beginning for us was like, well, somehow the fact that in the less specific case, when the noun is less specific, adding the modifier makes a bigger difference because the meaning that you're starting with isn't yet that specific. So it's just like somehow makes a bigger difference for the left A tail process. And so here I'm going to kind of put that intuition into an actual hypothesis. So let's imagine that these green dots represent the meaning of boat, as in they represent the features of boat. You can, you know, decompose them in your head in whatever way you want, but it's just a you know, a hypothesis like that is the distributed meaning of boat. And let's imagine that canoe has more features. It's a more specific concept. It has more features. Okay. So now the hypothesis would be that when we put the red feature into this set, it's more noticeable because there are fewer features in that set already. So it relates to so-called Weber's law of just noticeable differences, in case you're familiar with that. Whereas when we insert the red feature into the representation of canoe, it's less noticeable because there's already a lot of features in that representation. So that's the idea. So it's basically like the, you know, the proportional impact of the feature that's added would be the kind of driving force behind the size of the combinatory fact that we would elicit. So here, what I'm varying is the specificity of the head noun, okay? So there's a modifier stays constant. I'm varying the specificity of the head noun, and that is what we did in the original study by Masha Westerlund. But now, if this hypothesis is right, that it has to do with this kind of like, how noticeable is the difference? We should also be able to vary the modifier and see any fact that is a little different. Okay, so let's walk through that. This is the easiest to do when the modifiers are nouns. Adjective specificity is really hard to vary in any kind of theoretical, sensible way. But we can vary modifier specificity when the modifiers are nouns themselves. So here we have the head noun dish, okay? So we're imagining a dish as an edible dish, and we can have a more specific kind of dish like a tomato dish versus vegetable dish that's a little bit more general. So it could be a variety of different types of dishes could count as vegetable dishes, but tomato dish is a tomato dish. Okay, it's more specific. Okay, so now let's imagine that this is the feature space of dish. Okay, we're keeping that constant. And so now here, tomato, because you're inserting more features, a more specific feature set, actually makes a bigger difference than a more general feature set of vegetable. So here we're in some sense making a bigger splash into the representation than here. And so now that's interesting because if that's right, then although it was the more specific head noun, it was the less specific head noun that was eliciting the bigger composition effect when we were varying head noun specificity. it's actually the more specific modifier that should give you the bigger effect. So more specific hit now decreases the composition effect, whereas more specific modify increases the composition effect, if that hypothesis is right. Okay, so that's kind of complicated, but is that what actually happens? Would be a little surprising. Well, we have tested it, and actually that is a true pattern. And I'm saying true, I don't say that very easily, but we've now observed it several times. And so Linmin Zhang's dissertation has several instances of this type of an effect. So it really does seem to be an actual pattern in the activity of the left anterior temporal cortex. Okay. So what specific computations do these identified effects reflect? So for the left anterior temporal cortex, we feel pretty confidently that we can rule out a syntactic and a logical semantic computation. And so instead, really the process seems to have a more conceptual nature along the lines that I've now explained. And it is not just the case that every time concepts combine, you get this type of activity, but it is heavily modulated by the conceptual specificity level of the combining elements. And we have a lot more research on that if you want to check it out. What about the ventromedial prefrontal cortex? So I told you that there are these two effects. Now I've only told you kind of a longish story about the left ATL. Well, there are some things that we can also say about the ventromedial prefrontal cortex. I should qualify it by saying that we have studied it less. And the reasons for that are methodological in the sense that this actually tends to be a pretty noisy brain area to measure. It's very close to the eyes, and that makes the measurements a little bit tricky. Your eye blinks are big artifact makers, for example. It's also a tricky region in other techniques like fMRI. So it is in general a little bit of an artifactual area. But here is actually some older work that we had already before we did the basic composition red boat studies. And so I'm going to just tell you, like, what is the hypothesis that we can confidently rule out for the BMPFC? So what we know is that if we keep syntactic structure constant, like you know, the red canoe study, for example, did, so structure was constant, but vary the number of semantic steps that are needed for interpreting the expression. So you're keeping the syntactic structure constant, more or less, and you're varying how many steps do you have to do to compute the semantic structure. Then what we've seen in many experiments is that the ventromedial prefrontal cortex shows an increased signal when there are more semantic steps. And the expression that we used to initially study this question was so-called Coercion expressions. So look at this sentence. So the author began the article. Okay, seems like a perfectly simple sentence. You've probably heard it many times. But semantically, it's actually kind of interesting. And the reason for that is that begin is a verb that naturally selects for an event or an activity. So begin running, begin, you know, writing a letter and so forth. It describes the beginning of some activity. And so you would expect it to want to have some kind of an event or activity description as its direct object. But turns out it does not grammatically require that. It can take just like a basic entity describing element like the article as its object. But what happens in your brain, and we have a lot of behavioral evidence for that, mostly from the psycholinguistic work of Brian Macquarie, who was my co-author in this early work. What you do is you kind of take the article and convert that into some kind of an event description. So really what you're doing is interpreting this as saying the author began some activity involving the article. And the nature of the activity is left underspecified. And so, you know, you can sort of work it out from context. So if it's the author is probably writing, and so forth. And so then we can kind of construct a more straightforward sentence. The author wrote the article, or yeah, sorry about the typo. The author wrote the article, where there is no such kind of mismatch or extra step where you kind of work out like, oh, there's actually a covert event or activity meaning. And then we can construct an anomalous kind of a violation stimulus, which we did because at the time we very much wanted to relate the work to the existing N400 research. So the author pleased the article. So now the article is not a sentient thing that can be pleased about anything. So that's kind of your world knowledge that determines that this is bad. Okay, so what we saw was that MEG activity localizing in the ventromedial prefrontal cortex was systematically increased for these coercion conditions, and the activity so, you know, after about 400 milliseconds after the onset of the article, you would get this peak in the VMPFC. And so this is the nature of the argument that the VMPFC is also unlikely to reflect syntax. So it seems to be sensitive to the semantic structure and the semantic combinatory steps required to interpret an expression, as opposed to, you know, even though the syntax is at least superficially stays constant in these expressions. Okay, so we don't think that's syntax either. The logical semantic interpretation is not as crisply ruled out. But in general, the ventromedial prefrontal cortex actually figures in almost every sub-literature within the cognitive neurosciences. So this is definitely not anything that, you know, just operates in language. And, you know, I'm sort of skeptical that any region is like that anyway. But you will, you know, you will find this region in the literatures on not just semantic cognition, but affect, reward, decision-making, social cognition, lots and lots of subfields of cognitive neuroscience. So whatever its role is in language, it's most likely an instance of some more general computation that we observe in lots of different domains. And one, I think, quite plausible hypothesis is that this activity sort of represents the combinatory meaning at the end of the processing stream. So you kind of compose your meaning and then you have some sort of a representation, let's just say at the top of the sentential node in your syntactic tree. And that representation then interfaces with other systems like memory, action, affect, and so forth. Obviously, your language system has to interface with all the other cognitive systems. So that's my speculation, but at this point, it's just a speculation. So now I want to zoom out a little bit and just put the findings that we've now discussed about syntax semantics kind of on a timeline. And so this sort of reflects research that we've done in my lab over the years as regards composition, but also I'll give you some pointers to other literature. So we'll start with the left anterior temporal lobe. We've studied that the most. Roughly 200 to 250 milliseconds after the onset of the word, we see increased activity in this region when composition is happening, and it has this conceptual nature and heavily modulated by, you know, exactly what the conceptual content of the input items is. Okay, and then later we see this ventromedial prefrontal cortex combinatory effect, and as I just discussed, they also have a semantic nature and, you know, potentially kind of domain general, lots of subdomains of cognition seem to operate in this region. Okay, so those are the two that I've talked about so far. We ended up saying nothing about syntax. So I did not give you any neural correlate of the syntactic combinatory steps that by hypothesis also operate during language processing. This has turned out to be a very tricky question for our field, and we don't have a lot of compelling results for it yet. However, today, so I'm speaking in 2020, the posterior temporal lobe is rising as a pretty viable candidate for the neural processing of syntax. And so now, like in our group and in other groups, we're starting to have kind of a nice set of results that is pointing to that direction. We currently, like, our understanding of the specifics of the computation is still almost non-existent, but that's a very lively area of research. A couple other notes that I'm just going to add to this general picture. The angular gyrus, so now we're in the kind of junction between temporal cortex, parietal cortex, and even like the occipital lobe here. So that is also a region that you'll see mentioned a lot in the literature. It seems to be sensitive to relational processing, and in particular, it seems to participate in the processing of argument structure. So that is like the kind of contrast, for example, between intransitive and transitive verbs. When I talked about the 3 different types of knowledge, I also talked about relational nouns versus non-relational nouns. That's the kind of contrast that the angular gyrus seems to be sensitive to. And so exactly how this region contributes to argument structure research, argument structure processing is another active line of research. So then we've talked about Broca's area, left inferior frontal gyrus, and its role in long distance dependencies. When we measure those types of effects, with MEG, their timing is sort of mid latency like this, so around 300 to 400 milliseconds. And when we measure basic composition, so kind of variants of the type of paradigm that I've introduced here with fMRI, but usually slightly different tasks and slightly different stimuli from the materials that I discussed here, we also see effects in the LIFG. So there, the 2 techniques are not exactly consistent right now, but we have to observe that the designs are also not exactly the same. So this is the kind of bigger picture that is emerging right now. The research is still very much ongoing, but it's very active right now. So I think within the next, say, 5 years, we'll learn a lot more about the way that these regions talk to each other and how the brain actually represents and processes syntax and semantics. So it's kind of an exciting area for that topic, exciting time for this topic right now.